Welcome to Nidra Narratives. Settle in, like and subscribe this channel, and leave in comments what content would you like to see. Chapter 1. The Storm Before the Dawn. A World in Chaos. Tonight, we travel to a time when the greatest army the world had ever known stood at the edge of India, looked eastward toward a kingdom of unimaginable military might, and turned back in fear. The Macedonian soldiers who had conquered Persia, Egypt, and everything in between refused to march another step, and in that moment of exhaustion and mutiny, they unknowingly created the conditions for one of history's most remarkable transformations. How did a young man of obscure origins, guided by a brilliant but humiliated scholar, overthrow the most powerful dynasty in India? What kind of administrative genius allowed them to build an empire that would rival anything in the ancient world? And why did the techniques they pioneered, from sophisticated espionage networks to comprehensive economic regulation, establish patterns of governance that would influence Indian political thought for millennia? Let us travel back together to the fertile plains of northern India, to a world in flux, where empires were crumbling and new powers were waiting to be born. In the year 327 BCE, as the monsoon clouds gathered over the Punjab and the Indus swelled with seasonal rains, a Macedonian army that had conquered the known world from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Jhelum found itself at the edge of exhaustion. Alexander of Macedon, the young conqueror whom the Greeks called Megas, and whom history would remember as the Great, had pushed his weary soldiers through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush and across the 5 rivers of the Punjab, defeating King Porus in a battle that would become legendary. Yet, as his generals surveyed the vast plains stretching eastward toward the Gangetic heartland, that immense alluvial expanse stretching some 1,500 miles from the Punjab to the Bay of Bengal, created over millennia by the Ganges River depositing sediment eroded from the Himalayas, they heard troubling reports of what lay beyond. A kingdom called Magadha, ruled by a dynasty known as the Nandas, possessed military strength that dwarfed anything the Macedonians had yet encountered. The Greek historians who accompanied Alexander's expedition recorded with evident unease the intelligence gathered about this eastern power. According to Plutarch and Pliny, the Nanda army numbered some 200,000 infantry, 80,000 cavalry, 8,000 chariots, and 6,000 war elephants, a force that made even Alexander's battle-hardened veterans pause. The prospect of facing this formidable army, combined with nearly a decade of continuous campaigning far from home, sparked a mutiny among Alexander's homesick soldiers at the Beas River. The great conqueror, for the first time in his career, was forced to turn back. He would never return to India. Within 2 years, in 323 BCE, Alexander lay dead in Babylon, his vast empire fragmenting among his quarreling generals in what history would call the Wars of the Diadochi, the conflicts among Alexander's successors for control of his inheritance. While these generals fought over the Mediterranean world, reshaping the political geography from Egypt to Anatolia, the withdrawal of the Macedonians left northwestern India in a state of political chaos that would prove decisive for the subcontinent's future. Alexander had appointed satraps, Greek governors, a term borrowed from the Persian administrative system, where a satrap served as the king's representative with broad powers over military, judicial, and fiscal matters, to administer the territories he had nominally conquered. But these men found themselves increasingly isolated as news of Alexander's death spread. The Greek generals Eudemus and Python attempted to maintain control until around 317 BCE, but their authority was crumbling. Into this vacuum of power stepped a young man whose origins remained shrouded in legend, but whose ambition would reshape the political geography of South Asia. Chandragupta Maurya emerges from the mists of history as a figure about whom we possess no contemporary Indian sources and only fragmentary Greek references. The Greek historians knew him as Sandracotus or Sandracotus, and some accounts suggest he may have met Alexander himself during the Macedonians' brief Indian campaign. What we can state with greater certainty is his relationship with the Brahmin scholar Chanakya, also known as Kautilya or Vishnugupta, who would become his mentor, strategist, and chief minister. The Brahmins were the priestly, scholarly class who served as guardians of Hindu scripture and ritual, occupying the highest position in the social hierarchy, memorizing and transmitting the ancient hymns, and serving as advisors to kings and teachers of the young. According to later Indian traditions, preserved in texts like the Mudra Rakshasa and the Jain Parashishta Parvan, Chanakya was a teacher at the great center of learning at Takshashila, Taxila in modern Pakistan, where he witnessed firsthand the political turmoil created by the Macedonian invasion. The legends surrounding Chanakya's motivation for seeking the destruction of the Nanda dynasty vary in their details, but converge on a central theme of personal grievance transformed into political mission. Some accounts state that Chanakya visited the Nanda court at Pataliputra seeking patronage or donations, only to be publicly insulted by King Nanda or his servants. The Brahmin scholar, humiliated and enraged, is said to have untied his sacred thread, the symbol of his priestly status, worn across the chest by initiated Brahmins, and vowed never to bind it again until the Nanda dynasty was destroyed. Whether this dramatic narrative reflects historical reality or represents a later literary embellishment, it captures something essential about the political moment. The Nanda regime had made powerful enemies, and those enemies were now seeking instruments of revenge. The Nanda dynasty itself represented a significant departure from earlier Indian political traditions. According to the Puranas, the ancient Sanskrit texts of mythology and history, and Greek sources, the dynasty's founder, Mahapadma, had risen from humble origins to establish what was arguably the first empire to unite most of northern India. The Nandas had accumulated enormous wealth through systematic taxation and had built a military machine of unprecedented scale. Yet their very success had bred resentment. Ancient texts describe the Nanda rule as oppressive, characterized by excessive taxation and general misconduct. The Brahmanical sources, in particular, portrayed the Nandas as rulers who acted against dharma, the sacred moral order, the way things ought to be, encompassing duty, righteousness, and the proper functioning of society, and the Shastras, the ancient texts of law and conduct. It was in this atmosphere of political instability and simmering discontent that Chanakya recognized in the young Chandragupta the qualities of a natural leader: courage, charisma, and what the Greeks would later call the makings of a great king. According to various traditions, Chanakya either purchased Chandragupta from a hunter who had been raising him, or encountered him by chance and immediately perceived his potential. Whatever the circumstances of their meeting, Chanakya brought Chandragupta to Taxila, where the young man received an education in military tactics, statecraft, and the aesthetic arts that would prepare him for the monumental task ahead. To understand what Taxila represented, we must pause to appreciate this remarkable center of learning in the northwestern reaches of the subcontinent, where the mountains of the Hindu Kush gave way to the fertile valleys of Gandhara. Taxila was not a university in the modern sense, with formal admissions, standardized curricula, and official degrees. Rather, it functioned as a decentralized network of gurukulas, residential schools where students lived with individual teachers in private homes, ashrams, or simple dwellings. The relationship between guru and shishya, teacher and student, was intensely personal, built on years of close association, mutual respect, and the gradual transmission of knowledge through direct instruction, discussion, and debate. The curriculum at Taxila was remarkably comprehensive. The ancient and most revered scriptures, The Vedas, with their hymns, rituals, and philosophical speculations, formed the foundation of traditional learning. But Taxila offered far more than religious education. Law, medicine, astronomy, military science, grammar, philosophy, all found their masters at Taxila. Students came from far-off places such as Kashi, Kosala, and Magadha, undertaking long and arduous journeys to reach this renowned center. The grammarian Panini, whose Ashtadhyayi remains one of the greatest works on grammar ever composed, was a product of Taxila's intellectual environment. Jivaka, one of the most renowned physicians in ancient India, studied medicine there before becoming, according to Buddhist tradition, the personal physician of the Buddha himself. The city itself, situated at the junction of major trade routes, was a cosmopolitan place where diverse cultures met and mingled. Persians, Greeks, Scythians, and peoples from across the former Achaemenid Empire had passed through or settled in Taxila, bringing their languages, their customs, their ideas. This cultural diversity enriched the intellectual environment, exposing students to perspectives and knowledge traditions from far beyond the Indian subcontinent. When Alexander's army arrived in 326 BCE, the city surrendered without a fight, and the Macedonian conqueror is said to have been impressed by the learning he encountered there. It was in this environment that Chandragupta received his education, absorbing not only the practical skills of warfare and governance, but also the sophisticated political philosophy that would later be associated with his mentor. The strategic genius of Chanakya's approach lay in his understanding that the Nanda Empire, for all its military strength, was vulnerable to a coordinated campaign that combined military force with political subversion. Rather than immediately attacking the Nanda heartland, Chanakya and Chandragupta first turned their attention to the northwestern territories left in disarray by Alexander's withdrawal. By forming alliances with local rulers and recruiting mercenaries from the diverse peoples of the frontier regions, including, according to the Mudra Rakshasa, Balika from Bactria, Kirata from the Himalayan foothills, Parasika from Persia, Cambodia and Saka from Central Asia, and even Greek soldiers from the Punjab, they began assembling a force capable of challenging the Nanda military machine. This multinational army reflected both the cosmopolitan nature of the northwestern frontier and Chanakya's strategic insight that the Nanda military machine could only be overcome by combining the strengths of multiple military traditions. The period between approximately 323 and 322 BCE thus represents a crucial phase of preparation and consolidation. Chandragupta and Chanakya were not merely raising an army, they were building a political coalition, cultivating networks of supporters within the Nanda territories, and developing the intelligence capabilities that would later become a hallmark of Mauryan governance. The chaos following Alexander's death had created an unprecedented opportunity, and these two remarkable individuals, the visionary strategist and the ambitious young warrior, were positioning themselves to seize it. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic political transformations in ancient history. Chapter 2. The Revolutionary Campaign, From Defeat to Empire. The campaign to overthrow the Nanda dynasty stands as one of the most remarkable military and political achievements of the ancient world, yet its details remain frustratingly obscure. No contemporary account has survived, and we must reconstruct the narrative from sources written centuries after the events they describe. Buddhist texts like the Mahavansa, Jain chronicles, the Sanskrit drama Mudra Rakshasa, and scattered references in Greek and Roman historians. What emerges from these diverse sources is a picture of a prolonged struggle that combined conventional military operations with sophisticated political warfare, a campaign that would establish patterns of statecraft that the Mauryan Empire would employ for generations. The initial phase of Chandragupta's campaign focused on consolidating control over the northwestern territories that had been thrown into chaos by by Alexander's withdrawal. According to Plutarch, Chandragupta first overthrew Alexander's prefects in the northwest of India, a process that likely occurred between 323 and 317 BCE, as the Greek satraps found themselves increasingly isolated following Alexander's death. By approximately 316 BCE, Chandragupta had defeated and absorbed all the Greek satrapies in the mountains of Central Asia, extending his control to the edge of modern-day Iran, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. This northwestern consolidation was not merely a territorial acquisition. It provided Chandragupta with battle-hardened troops, including Greek mercenaries, whose experience of Macedonian military tactics would prove invaluable in the campaigns to come. According to the Jain tradition and the Mudra Rakshasa, Chandragupta also formed an alliance with a Himalayan king named Parvatka, sometimes identified with Porus, the ruler whom Alexander had defeated at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Whether this identification is accurate remains disputed among scholars, but the alliance itself appears to have been genuine, providing Chandragupta with additional military resources and political legitimacy as he prepared to challenge the Nanda heartland. The campaign against the Nandas proper appears to have begun with a strategic error that Chanakya would later transform into a teaching moment. According to Buddhist and Jain traditions, Chandragupta's initial attacks on the Nanda capital of Pataliputra were repelled, as the Nanda Empire possessed a formidable army that could concentrate overwhelming force against a direct assault. The Buddhist Mahavamsa Tika and Jain Parashishtaparvam record that Chandragupta's army unsuccessfully attacked the Nanda capital, suffering a decisive defeat that forced them to disband and regroup. It was at this point, according to a famous legend preserved in the Jain texts, that Chanakya learned a crucial lesson from an unlikely source. Observing an old woman scolding her child for burning his fingers by eating from the center of a hot dish rather than the cooler edges, Chanakya realized that their strategy had been fundamentally flawed. They had attacked the center of Nanda power directly, where resistance was strongest, rather than systematically weakening the periphery first. This insight, whether historically accurate or a later pedagogical invention, encapsulates the strategic approach that would characterize the successful phase of the campaign. The revised strategy involved what modern military theorists might call a campaign of peripheral attrition, combined with political subversion. Chandragupta and Chanakya raised a new army and began capturing the border villages and outer territories of the Nanda realm, gradually advancing toward the center while avoiding direct confrontation with the main Nanda forces. This approach served multiple purposes. It deprived the Nanda treasury of revenue from outlying regions. It demonstrated to local populations that the Nanda regime could not protect them, and it allowed Chandragupta to build momentum and recruit additional supporters as his campaign progressed. The political dimension of the campaign was equally important. Chanakya's strategy included forging alliances with disaffected elements within the Nanda administration, encouraging defections among military commanders and provincial officials, and spreading propaganda against the ruling dynasty. The techniques described in the Arthashastra, the great treatise on statecraft, whose title literally means the science of wealth or the science of material prosperity, referring to one of the four proper goals of human life in classical Indian thought, describe precisely these methods: the use of spies to gather intelligence and sow dissension, the employment of bribes and promises to win over enemy officials, and the systematic exploitation of grievances against the ruling power. The Nanda's reputation for excessive taxation and oppressive rule provided ample material for such political warfare. The final siege of Pataliputra, which likely began around 320 BCE, represented the culmination of this patient campaign of encirclement and subversion. The Buddhist text Milinda Panna describes a war between the Nanda general Bhaddasala and Chandragupta that resulted in enormous casualties. Figures that, while obviously exaggerated, suggests that the final confrontation was indeed a violent affair. By 321 BCE, Chandragupta had captured Pataliputra and established himself as the ruler of Magadha. The fate of Nanda, the last Nanda king, varies in different accounts. Some sources state that he was killed during the siege, while others suggest he abdicated and went into exile, disappearing from the pages of history. The capture of Pataliputra marked the end of the Nanda dynasty and the beginning of the Mauryan Empire. Chanakya, according to tradition, found the treasure of Nanda through a fisherman and appointed Chandragupta as the new king. The significance of this achievement cannot be overstated. Chandragupta had not merely replaced one dynasty with another. He had demonstrated that a determined leader with the right strategy could overthrow even the most powerful established regime. Yet the work of empire building had only begun. The consolidation of Chandragupta's power required not only the subjugation of the Indian subcontinent, but also the resolution of a fundamental question. What would be the relationship between this new Indian power and the Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from the wreckage of Alexander's empire? The answer came through a confrontation with Seleucus, the first Nicator, one of Alexander's most capable generals, who had established himself as ruler of the vast Seleucid Empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Seleucus had founded his empire in 312 BCE, establishing himself in Babylon and gradually extending his control over the enormous eastern portion of Alexander's former territories. By the early years of the 3rd century BCE, he had consolidated his power in Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia, and his ambitions naturally turned toward the Indian territories that Alexander had briefly conquered. The satrapies of the northwest, Gandhara, Paropamisadai, Arachosia, and Gedrosia, had been part of Alexander's empire, and Seleucus considered them his rightful inheritance. In 305 BCE, Seleucus crossed the Indus River with a substantial army, seeking to reclaim these territories from Chandragupta Maurya. The details of the conflict that followed remain frustratingly obscure. Greek and Roman sources provide only fragmentary information, and no Indian account of the war has survived. Modern scholars have noted that none of the ancient authors depicted either Seleucus or Chandragupta as the clear victor. This lack of information about the encounter means that it is impossible to reconstruct it with certainty. What we can deduce from the terms of the peace treaty, however, suggests that Chandragupta held the stronger position at the war's conclusion. The treaty, concluded around 303 BCE, resulted in Seleucus ceding to Chandragupta the satrapies of Paropamisadai, roughly the region around modern Kabul, Arachosia around Kandahar, and Gedrosia in Balochistan, and possibly parts of Arya as far as Herat. In exchange, Chandragupta provided Seleucus with 500 war elephants, a military asset that would prove decisive in Seleucus's subsequent campaigns against his rivals in the west. The treaty was strengthened by a marriage alliance, though the exact nature of this arrangement remains unclear. Some sources suggest that Seleucus gave his daughter to Chandragupta in marriage, which would make the Mauryan emperor's descendants partly Greek by blood, a tantalizing possibility that has led some historians to speculate that Ashoka, Chandragupta's grandson, may have had a Greek grandmother. Whatever its precise nature, the marriage alliance signaled that the Seleucid Empire recognized the Mauryan Empire as an equal, a fellow great power worthy of dynastic connection. The strategic implications of this settlement were profound for both parties. For Chandragupta, the treaty secured his western frontier against the most formidable military power in the region, allowing him to focus on consolidating and expanding his empire within the subcontinent. The acquisition of the northwestern territories extended Mauryan control to the natural boundaries of the Hindu Kush Mountains, providing a defensible frontier against future invasions from Central Asia. For Seleucus, the 500 war elephants acquired from Chandragupta would play a decisive role in his victory against his rival Antigonus at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, a battle that effectively ended the wars of the Diadochi and established Seleucid dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. These massive creatures, standing up to 10 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing several tons, had been used in Indian warfare for centuries, but it was Chandragupta's empire that brought them to the attention of the Hellenistic world in a way that would reshape Mediterranean warfare for generations. When Antigonus's son Demetrius led a successful cavalry charge that drove the enemy cavalry from the field, he pursued too far, and Seleucus deployed his elephants as a living wall to prevent Demetrius from returning to support his father. The Antigonid infantry, exposed and demoralized, began to defect or flee, and Antigonus was killed. Indian military resources, in other words, helped determine the outcome of the wars of the Diadochi and shape the political structure of the Hellenistic world. Perhaps equally significant was the diplomatic relationship established between the two empires. Seleucus dispatched an ambassador, Megasthenes, to the Mauryan court at Pataliputra, where he resided for several years, possibly between 302 and 298 BCE. Megasthenes was the first person from the Western world to leave a written description of India, composing a work called the Indica that, though now lost, has been partially reconstructed from quotations in later Greek and Roman authors. His observations provide invaluable evidence for the nature of Chandragupta's empire and the city of Pataliputra, and it is through his eyes that we can now enter the imperial capital. Chapter 3. The Wooden Walls of Pataliputra. Life in the imperial capital. Let us drift now through the wooden gates of Pataliputra, that vast metropolis sprawling along the confluence of the Ganges and Son rivers, where the warm, humid air of the Gangetic plain carried the mingled scents of river mud, temple incense, and the sharp tang of iron being worked in countless forges. This was no ordinary city. It was, in the late 4th century BCE, one of the largest urban centers in the ancient world, a parallelogram of wooden walls stretching some 15 kilometers in length and 2.5 kilometers in width, its 64 gates opening onto a world of commerce, craft, and imperial ambition that would have astonished even the most cosmopolitan traveler from the Mediterranean. Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador who resided at the Mauryan court for several years, left us precious fragments of description that allow us to reconstruct something of this vanished world. He described broad streets lined with large houses and well-maintained public buildings, a city divided into distinct quarters according to social class and economic activity. The wealthy merchants and landowners occupied centrally located, well-designed homes, while artisans and laborers resided in more peripheral areas, though even these, by the standards of the age, were well-planned and accessible. Public spaces punctuated the urban fabric. Gardens and parks, small temples and meeting halls placed at central intersections, ensuring that every resident had access to communal gathering places where the rhythms of daily life could unfold. The city's defences were formidable yet distinctly Indian in their construction. Unlike the stone fortifications of the Mediterranean world, Pataliputra was protected by massive wooden palisades, enormous timbers that modern archaeologists have excavated at sites like Qumran and Bulandi Bagh, confirming the Greek accounts. These wooden walls were pierced by 570 towers and surrounded by a vast moat, some 900 feet wide, according to Megasthenes, fed by the waters of the Son River. The choice of wood over stone was deliberate. In a land where monsoon rains could devastate brick structures, and where the alluvial plain provided few quarries but abundant forests, timber construction made practical sense. The soft creak of these massive wooden walls in the wind, the splash of water in the defensive moat, the calls of sentries from the towers. These would have been the constant background sounds of life in the imperial capital. Within the walls, the royal palace complex occupied a position of supreme prominence. Aelian, drawing on Megasthenes' Lost Indica, described Indian palaces as superior in splendor to Persia's Susa or Ecbatana, a remarkable claim given the legendary opulence of the Achaemenid capitals. In the heart of the city stood the royal residence, set within a walled park where ornamental trees provided shade, where tame peacocks and pheasants wandered among the gardens, and where lakes full of sacred fish glittered in the sunlight. The peacock, that iridescent bird whose cry echoes across the Indian plains before the monsoon, held special significance for the Mauryan dynasty. Indeed, Buddhist tradition suggests the very name Maurya derived from Mora, the Pali word for peacock, connecting the imperial family to a place where these magnificent birds were abundant. The palace architecture itself showed clear influences from the Achaemenid tradition that had once ruled the northwestern territories, now incorporated into Chandragupta's empire. Gilded pillars, sculpted wooden panels, water channels that cooled the air in the summer heat. These elements blended Persian sophistication with indigenous Indian styles. The highly polished stone columns that archaeologists have recovered from the Pataliputra area display a lustrous finish that rivals the famous northern black polished ware pottery of the period, suggesting that Mauryan craftsmen had developed techniques of stone polishing that would later reach their apogee in the pillars of Ashoka. The municipal administration of Pataliputra was remarkably sophisticated. Megasthenes described a city council of 30 commissioners, divided into 6 boards of 5 members each board responsible for different aspects of urban governance. One board fixed wages and oversaw the provision of goods. Another made arrangements for foreign dignitaries, tourists, and businessmen. A third maintained records and registrations. A fourth supervised manufactured goods and the sale of commodities. A fifth regulated trade and issued licenses. And a sixth collected taxes on sales. This division of responsibilities, this systematic approach to urban management, represented a level of administrative sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for many centuries. Beyond the palace precincts, the city hummed with commercial activity. Markets sold spices, precious stones, ivory, and textiles from across the subcontinent, while horses from Central Asia and Persian and Greek wines arrived along the overland routes connecting Taxila to the imperial capital. The city minted standardized punch-marked silver coins, small, irregular pieces of metal bearing symbols of wheels, elephants, and trees that facilitated trade throughout the empire. These coins, measured in units called panas, formed the basis of the monetary economy. A soldier received 500 panas annually, a clerk 120 panas, while the highest officials commanded salaries of 48,000 panas. The houses of ordinary citizens were typically constructed of mud brick or wood, with thatched roofs and interior courtyards where much of daily life took place. The warm glow of oil lamps illuminated these domestic spaces after sunset, casting flickering shadows on walls that might be decorated with simple geometric patterns or images of auspicious symbols. Families gathered in these courtyards to share meals, to conduct household rituals, to escape the heat of the day in the shade of overhanging eaves. Water was essential to life in Pataliputra, and the city's infrastructure reflected this necessity. Ring wells, cylindrical structures of terracotta rings stacked one upon another, allowed settlements to access groundwater, freeing urban development from strict dependence on proximity to rivers. The streets of Pataliputra would have presented a kaleidoscope of humanity. Brahmin priests in white garments, their sacred threads visible across their chests. Buddhist monks in their distinctive robes, begging bowls in hand. Jain ascetics practicing their rigorous disciplines. Merchants from distant lands speaking languages that ranged from Greek to the tongues of Central Asia. Soldiers of the imperial army their weapons gleaming, farmers bringing produce to market, craftsmen of every description, potters, weavers, metalworkers, jewelers, carpenters, leather workers. The city was the meeting point of cultures, a place where the ancient traditions of the Gangetic Plain encountered the influences of the wider world that Alexander's conquests had opened to Indian awareness. The material culture of these inhabitants reflected centuries of craft tradition. The fundamental garment for men was the antarya, a length of unstitched cloth wrapped around the lower body in what was called the kachar style. Both equal ends taken between the legs after knotting at the front, then held diagonally, fluted, and tucked into the waist at the back. Over this, men of status wore the uttariya, a long scarf that served as an upper garment, its precise arrangement conveying subtle messages about the wearer's role and rank. Women wore ankle-length skirts with blouses or shawls, and it was in jewelry that they truly expressed their aesthetic sensibilities. The makala, a 6-stringed hip belt of gold or silver beads. The lambanam, a long necklace of chains. Trumpet-shaped earrings called Chanakya, 10 bracelets on each hand, and anklets of twisted wire whose soft jingling accompanied every step. The textiles that made these garments possible came from a sophisticated industry. Cotton remained the primary fiber, cultivated across the subcontinent since the days of the Indus Valley civilization. The Arthashastra mentions important cotton textile centers at Madura, Apparent, Kalinga, Kashi, Vatsa, and Mahishmati, each with its distinctive weaving traditions. Silk, called corsair when produced from cocoons, or chinamsuka when imported from China, represented the height of luxury. The dyes that colored these fabrics came from natural sources, lac, madder, and indigo, while turmeric provided the sacred yellow color used for ceremonial purposes. As evening descended over Pataliputra, the city would have transformed. The bustle of commerce gave way to quieter rhythms. The chanting of priests at household shrines, the soft music of stringed instruments drifting from wealthy homes, the calls of night watchmen making their rounds. The great wooden walls, silhouetted against the darkening sky, enclosed a world of extraordinary complexity and vitality, a world that Chandragupta had created and that his descendants would rule for generations to come. The warm night air, heavy with the scent of jasmine and the distant smell of the river, wrapped the sleeping city in its embrace, while in the palace, the business of empire continued by lamplight, as ministers and spies reported to their sovereign on the state of his vast domains. For the true revolution wrought by Chandragupta Maurya lay not merely in the territories he conquered, but in the administrative apparatus he created to govern them. Before the Mauryas, the Indian subcontinent had been fragmented into hundreds of kingdoms and republics, each with its own systems of governance, taxation, and military organization. What Chandragupta and Chanakya constructed was something fundamentally new, a centralized bureaucratic state capable of projecting power across vast distances, collecting revenue systematically, maintaining internal security through an elaborate intelligence network, and sustaining a permanent military establishment of unprecedented scale. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Empire. Administration and Espionage. At the apex of the Mauryan administrative system stood the emperor himself, wielding absolute power, but constrained by practical necessities and advised by a council of ministers known as the Mantra Parishad. According to both Megasthenes' observations and the prescriptions of the Arthashastra, the king was aided and advised by this council in day-to-day administration, though ultimate authority remained with the sovereign. The council included the Purohita, or chief priest, the Mahamantri, or chief minister, the Senapati, or commander-in-chief, and the Yuvaraja, or crown prince, along with other high officials responsible for specific functions of government. The highest functionaries at the center were called Tirthas, and according to the Arthashastra, They numbered 18 and received salaries of 48,000 panas, an enormous sum that reflected both their importance and the state's interest in securing their loyalty. Below these senior officials extended a vast bureaucracy organized into specialized departments, each headed by a superintendent called an adhyaksha. The Arthashastra mentions 27 such superintendents, mostly responsible for regulating economic activities: the superintendent of mines, the superintendent of metals, the superintendent of the mint, the superintendent of commerce, the superintendent of agriculture, and many others. This departmental structure, with its clear division of responsibilities and hierarchical chains of command, represented a level of administrative sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for many centuries. The Mauryan Empire was divided into provinces for administrative purposes, with the imperial capital at Pataliputra serving as the center of direct royal administration. According to the edicts of Ashoka, which provide our most reliable evidence for Mauryan provincial organization, the empire included 4 major provinces, with capitals at Taxila in the north, Ujjain in the west, Tosali in the east, and Suvarnagiri in the south. Each province was governed by a Kumara, or royal prince, who administered the territory as the emperor's representative with the assistance of Mahamatyas, or regional prime ministers. This practice of appointing princes as provincial governors served multiple purposes. It provided training for potential successors, ensured that the most important territories were governed by individuals with direct ties to the royal family, and reduced the risk of provincial officials developing independent power bases. Below the provincial level, the empire was further subdivided into districts, each administered by officials responsible for revenue collection, law enforcement, and local governance. The Rajukars served as district officers with functions similar to modern district collectors, while Gopas oversaw groups of 5 to 10 villages, and Stanakas served as tax collectors at the sub-district level. At the village level, a Gramani or village headman, often appointed by the central government, but working alongside a council of village elders, maintained local order and resolved disputes. This hierarchical structure, extending from the emperor's court to the smallest village, enabled the Mauryan state to project its authority into the daily lives of its subjects in ways that earlier Indian kingdoms had never achieved. The revenue system that supported this administrative apparatus was both comprehensive and sophisticated. The Mauryan state claimed ownership of all land and collected taxes on agricultural production, typically amounting to 1/6 of the harvest, according to most sources, though rates could vary based on local conditions and the productivity of the land. Beyond agricultural taxes, the state collected duties on trade, fees for the use of roads and ferries, and revenues from state monopolies on mining, salt production, and the manufacture of armaments. Through the disciplined central authority of the Mauryan Empire, farmers were freed from the arbitrary exactions of local chieftains and regional kings. Instead, they paid a nationally administered system of taxation that, while strict, was at least predictable and theoretically fair. The revenues thus collected funded an ambitious program of public works: the construction of roads connecting the major cities of the empire, irrigation systems to enhance agricultural productivity, rest houses for travelers, and the maintenance of the standing army that protected the empire's frontiers and maintained internal order. The Sudarshan Lake, constructed by Chandragupta Maurya in the Girnar region of Gujarat, represented one of the most important engineering ventures of the empire, demonstrating the state's commitment to water management and agricultural improvement. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of Mauryan administration was its elaborate espionage system. The goals of this secret service were multiple: to test the integrity of government officials, to spy on the population for signs of conspiracy or rebellion, to monitor hostile kingdoms, to destabilize enemy states, and to eliminate troublesome individuals who could not be challenged openly. The organizational structure of the spy system included stationed agents headed by intelligence officers, mobile agents including assassins and executing agents, double agents who provoked people to extract information, counter agents to monitor hostile spies, and collectors of financial intelligence. The Arthashastra describes two main categories of spies: sanstha, or stationary spies, who establish themselves in fixed positions as merchants, ascetics, or farmers to gather information from the general population, and sanchara, or mobile spies, who travel between locations disguised as traders or performers. These spies could assume virtually any identity: students, recluses, householders, merchants, ascetics, or even government officials. Student spies reported on discontent among the youth. Householder spies ascertained the fair collection of taxes. Merchant spies determined the quality and price of royal merchandise. Ascetic spies gathered information about honest and dishonest proceedings among villagers. The intelligence gatherers and interpreters were kept separate so that they would not know one another, reducing the risk of the entire network being compromised. Cipher writing, code words, and secret languages were employed, and the services of courier pigeons were enlisted for rapid communication. The military establishment that this administrative apparatus supported was equally impressive. According to Megasthenes, the Mauryan army was managed by a war office consisting of 30 members distributed among 6 boards of 5 members each. These boards were responsible for different aspects of military administration: the navy, transport and commissariat, infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. The tactical organization of the Mauryan army featured a basic unit called the Patti, a mixed group comprising 1 elephant carrying 3 archers and a mahout, the driver who controlled the animal, 3 cavalry armed with javelins and spears, and 5 infantry soldiers armed with shields or bows. This combined arms approach, integrating different types of troops into coordinated tactical units, represented a significant innovation in Indian military organization. The soldiers of the Mauryan army were well paid, receiving salaries of 500 panas according to the Arthashastra, considerably more than clerks at 120 panas or servants at 60 panas. Megasthenes noted that the soldiers were so well paid that they could maintain others on their wages, and the state provided them with arms and equipment, ensuring that the army remained a professional force loyal to the central government, rather than to individual commanders or regional lords. To understand the revolutionary nature of this administrative system, we must place it in the context of the great bureaucratic empires of the ancient world. The most obvious comparison is with the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which at its height under Darius I had controlled territories stretching from the Indus to the Aegean. The Persian satrapy system provided a model of provincial administration that influenced every subsequent empire in the region. Under Darius, the empire was divided into approximately 20 to 30 satrapies, each governed by a satrap who served as the king's representative. To prevent satraps from becoming too powerful, Darius instituted a system of checks and balances: a military commander independent of the satrap's authority, a secretary who reported directly to the king, and a network of inspectors known as the king's eyes and ears, who traveled throughout the empire monitoring the conduct of officials. The Mauryan system adopted some elements of this Persian model while introducing significant innovations. Like the Persians, the Mauryans divided their empire into provinces governed by royal appointees, in the Mauryan case, often princes of the royal family. Like the Persians, the Mauryans maintained an elaborate intelligence network to monitor both officials and subjects. But the Mauryan bureaucracy appears to have been more specialized, more deeply involved in economic regulation, and more systematically organized than its Persian predecessor. The comparison with Ptolemaic Egypt, Chandragupta's contemporary, is equally instructive. Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's generals, had established himself as ruler of Egypt in the 320s BCE. At almost exactly the same time, that Chandragupta was consolidating his power in India. Ptolemy and his successors created what modern scholars have called a command economy, a system of state control over economic life that was unprecedented in the Hellenistic world. The parallels with the Mauryan system are striking. Both empires claimed royal ownership of land, though both also allowed various forms of private or quasi-private landholding. Both maintained elaborate systems of taxation that went far beyond simple agricultural levies. Both employed large bureaucracies organized into specialized departments, each with clearly defined responsibilities. When we step back and view these various administrative systems in their totality, what becomes clear is that the Mauryan Empire represented one of the most sophisticated attempts in the ancient world to create a centralized bureaucratic state capable of governing vast territories and diverse populations. It was not simply imitating Persian or Hellenistic models, but developing distinctly Indian solutions to universal problems of imperial governance. The system that Chandragupta and Chanakya created would provide the administrative foundation for Ashoka's later achievements and would influence Indian political thought and practice for centuries to come. Chapter 5. The Sacred and the Secular. Religion, Village Life, and the Arthashastra. Beyond the wooden walls of Pataliputra, beyond the bustling markets and the administrative machinery of empire, lay the true foundation of Mauryan power. The villages where the majority of the population lived, the fields where crops grew, the rhythms of agricultural life that sustained the entire edifice of state. For it was during the Mauryan period that the transition to settled agriculture was completed across much of northern India, transforming the economy and society in ways that would shape the subcontinent for millennia to come. The village, the grama, was the basic unit of the Mauryan economy, and the gramika, or village headman, served as the crucial link between the imperial administration and the farming families who worked the land. The crops that filled the fields of Mauryan India were diverse and abundant. Rice, barley, millet, and wheat formed the staple grains, their golden heads swaying in the fields as harvest approached. Sugarcane grew in the fertile alluvial soils, its sweet juice a luxury that Indians had enjoyed since ancient times. Indeed, the process of refining sugarcane juice into crystals was discovered in India around the 3rd century BCE, during or shortly after Chandragupta's reign. Pulses of various kinds, lentils, beans, chickpeas, provided essential protein, while sesame, pepper, saffron, mustard, and linseed added flavor and variety to the diet. Megasthenes, observing this agricultural abundance, reported that India did not experience famine and that farmers could harvest crops twice a year, a testament to the fertility of the Gangetic plain and the sophistication of irrigation systems that the Mauryan state actively promoted. The relationship between the farmer and the state was complex and carefully regulated. Under the Mauryan system, all land was owned by the emperor, to whom tribute was paid by the laboring class. In return, the emperor supplied the laborers with agricultural products, animals, seeds, tools, public infrastructure, and stored food in reserve for times of crisis. The tax burden varied according to the type of land and the resources provided by the state. If a farmer cultivated land using only his own resources, he paid 1/6 of the crop, the traditional bhaga that had ancient sanction. If he used water from rivers or lakes provided by state irrigation works, he paid 1/4 of the crop as udaka bhaga, or water tax. The Sittadhyaksha, or superintendent of agriculture, oversaw the state farms and reported agricultural output to tax authorities. Village life followed the rhythms of the agricultural calendar, the preparation of fields before the monsoon, the anxious watching of clouds as the rains approached, the back-breaking labor of planting, the constant vigilance against pests and disease, the joy of harvest, the careful storage of grain against the lean months ahead. Houses in villages were typically made of mud brick or wood, with thatched roofs and courtyards, simpler than urban dwellings, but following similar patterns of domestic organization. Each village had a local assembly, a panchayat, to resolve disputes and manage common affairs, a tradition of local self-governance that would persist in Indian villages for millennia. The food that emerged from these agricultural labours was prepared and consumed according to traditions that were already ancient. Rice and wheat were the foundations of most meals, prepared in various ways. Rice boiled or steamed, wheat ground into flour and baked into flatbreads called chapatis. Lentils, the dal that remains central to Indian cuisine, were cooked into soups and stews, their earthy flavour complementing the grains. Vegetables were prepared with spices that had been cultivated in India since at least 3000 BCE. Turmeric, cardamom, black pepper and mustard added flavour and were believed to have medicinal properties according to the Ayurvedic tradition. Food was typically served on banana leaves or clay plates, and people ate with their hands, a practice that continues in India today. Megasthenes noted that farmers were the second most respected class in Indian society, after philosophers, a ranking that reflected their importance to the economic sustenance of the country. They enjoyed the privilege of being exempted from military service, their labour considered too essential to the welfare of the state to be interrupted by the demands of war. The spiritual landscape of Chandragupta's empire was a tapestry of extraordinary complexity, woven from threads both ancient and new. This was an age of religious ferment, when the old Vedic traditions were being challenged and transformed, when new movements like Buddhism and Jainism were gaining adherents across the Gangetic plain, and when the concepts of karma, rebirth, and liberation that would define Indian spirituality for millennia were crystallizing into their classical forms. The Brahmanical tradition, rooted in the Vedas and elaborated through centuries of ritual practice and philosophical speculation, remained the dominant religious force among the upper castes. Their rituals, centered on the sacred fire and the precise recitation of mantras, connected the human world to the cosmic order, ensuring the prosperity of the kingdom and the proper functioning of society. Yet even within the Brahmanical tradition, significant changes were underway. The Upanishads, philosophical texts that had emerged in the centuries before Chandragupta's rise, had shifted emphasis from external sacrifice to internal realization. The concept of Brahman, the ultimate reality, the universal soul that underlies all existence, and its identity with Atman, the individual soul within each person, offered a path to liberation that did not depend on elaborate rituals or priestly intermediaries. This internal critique of Brahmanical ritualism found even more radical expression in the Shramana movements, the traditions of wandering ascetics who rejected the authority of the Vedas and sought liberation through their own efforts. The most significant of these movements were Jainism and Buddhism, both of which had emerged in the Magadha region in the 6th or 5th century BCE, roughly 2 centuries before Chandragupta's rise to power. Jainism, associated with the teacher Mahavira, the 24th Tirthankara or ford maker, who showed the way across the ocean of rebirth, emphasized extreme non-violence, called ahimsa, and rigorous asceticism as the path to liberation. Jain monks practiced austerities that astonished observers, fasting for extended periods, pulling out their hair rather than cutting it, sweeping the ground before them to avoid stepping on insects, straining their drinking water to prevent harming tiny creatures. Later Jain tradition claims that Chandragupta himself embraced Jainism toward the end of his life, abdicating his throne and traveling south with the Jain monk Bhadrabahu, eventually fasting to death in the Jain manor at Shravanabelagola in Karnataka. Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, or awakened one, offered a middle path between the extreme asceticism of the Jains and the ritualism of the Brahmins. The Buddha's teaching centered on the Four Noble Truths: that life involves suffering, that suffering arises from desire, that suffering can be ended, and that the way to end suffering is the Eightfold Path of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. By Chandragupta's time, Buddhist communities, the Sangha of monks and nuns supported by lay followers, had spread across northern India. The religious diversity of the Mauryan period extended beyond these major traditions. For ordinary people, religious life was less a matter of philosophical systems than of daily practice. The household rituals performed at dawn and dusk, the offerings made to local deities at village shrines, the festivals that marked the agricultural calendar, the pilgrimages to sacred sites. Yaksha and Yakshi worship, the veneration of nature spirits associated with trees, water sources, and fertility, remained widespread, as evidenced by the numerous terracotta and stone sculptures of these figures that archaeologists have recovered from Mauryan period sites. The religious landscape of Chandragupta's empire, then, was one of remarkable pluralism and dynamism. Ancient Vedic traditions coexisted with new philosophical movements. Rigorous ascetics walked the same roads as prosperous merchants. Village shrines to local deities stood alongside the emerging institutions of Buddhist and Jain monasticism. This diversity was not merely tolerated, but actively fostered by the Mauryan state, which recognized the value of religious harmony for political stability. No discussion of the Mauryan state apparatus can be complete without addressing the Arthashastra, the remarkable treatise on statecraft that tradition attributes to Chanakya. Yet the relationship between this text and the actual practices of Chandragupta's empire is more complex than popular accounts suggest. The Arthashastra was rediscovered in 1905, when a Sanskrit manuscript was found in the Oriental Research Institute, and its publication caused a sensation among scholars of ancient India. The text appeared to offer an unprecedented window into the political thought and administrative practices of the Mauryan period. However, recent scholarship has fundamentally revised our understanding of when and how the Arthashastra was composed. The current scholarly consensus places the text's final composition significantly later than the Mauryan era, somewhere between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE. Several arguments support this later dating. The Arthashastra describes a small state surrounded by other small states, not an extensive empire like that of the Mauryas. Most strikingly, the Arthashastra prescribes stone fortifications for defensive purposes, whereas archaeological excavations at Pataliputra have revealed that the Mauryan capital was defended by wooden palisades, a discrepancy that would be impossible if the text's author had actually served as Chandragupta's minister. Yet even if the Arthashastra in its current form postdates the Mauryan period, it likely preserves elements of earlier political thought and may reflect traditions that originated in Chanakya's circle. The core principles of the text, the emphasis on centralized authority, the elaborate bureaucratic structure, the comprehensive approach to revenue collection, the sophisticated intelligence network, the pragmatic approach to foreign policy, may well reflect Mauryan innovations, even if the specific details were elaborated by later authors. The Arthashastra's pragmatic, results-oriented approach to politics finds its closest parallel not in ancient Greek philosophy, but in the work of Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat who wrote The Prince in 1513 CE, nearly 2 millennia after the Mauryan period. The comparison has been made so often that Chanakya is sometimes called the Indian Machiavelli, a sobriquet that, as the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen has noted, is rather amusing given that Chanakya preceded Machiavelli by some 18 centuries. Both works share a willingness to discuss the harsher realities of political power that more idealistic philosophers prefer to ignore. Both recognize that the appearance of virtue may be more important than virtue itself. Both understand that successful statecraft requires a clear-eyed assessment of human nature and political realities, rather than wishful thinking about how people ought to behave. Yet there are also significant differences. The Arthashastra is far more comprehensive than the Prince, covering not just the acquisition and maintenance of power, but also detailed prescriptions for economic policy, military organization, judicial administration, and diplomatic relations. Moreover, the Arthashastra, for all its pragmatism, operates within a framework of dharma, the notion that the king's ultimate purpose is to promote the welfare and security of his subjects. This concept of righteous rule, however flexibly interpreted, provides a moral dimension that is largely absent from Machiavelli's more purely instrumental approach to politics. Chapter 6. The Legacy of the First Emperor. A World Transformed. And so we come to the twilight of Chandragupta's reign, to the years when this remarkable figure, who had risen from obscurity to build one of the ancient world's greatest empires, began to contemplate his legacy and, according to some traditions, his own departure from the world of power and ambition. The empire he had constructed, stretching from the Hindu Kush mountains in the northwest to the Bay of Bengal in the east, from the Himalayas in the north to the Deccan Plateau in the south, represented an unprecedented achievement in Indian political history, a unification of the subcontinent that would not be matched for centuries. The administrative machinery that Chandragupta and Chanakya had created would prove more durable than the dynasty itself. The patterns of centralized governance they established, the provincial system with its hierarchy of officials, the comprehensive approach to revenue collection, the standing army maintained by the state, the elaborate intelligence network, would influence Indian political thought and practice for millennia. Later dynasties, including the Guptas, who would preside over a golden age of Indian culture some 6 centuries later, explicitly claimed connection to the Mauryan tradition and sought to emulate its administrative achievements. The military innovations of the Mauryan period, particularly the systematic use of war elephants, had reshaped not only Indian warfare, but the military practices of the entire ancient world. The 500 elephants that Chandragupta provided to Seleucus had proved decisive at the Battle of Ipsus, demonstrating to the Hellenistic kingdoms the military value of this distinctly Indian weapon. The elephant trade that followed connected the Mauryan Empire to the Mediterranean world in ways that would persist for centuries, as Hellenistic and later Roman powers sought to acquire these formidable creatures for their own armies. The diplomatic relationships established during Chandragupta's reign had opened India to the wider world in unprecedented ways. Megasthenes' residence at the Mauryan court had produced the first detailed Western account of Indian civilization, a work that, though now lost, shaped Greek and Roman understanding of the subcontinent for centuries. Later Greek ambassadors, Dimachus under Chandragupta's son Bindusara, Dionysius under his grandson Ashoka, maintained these connections, while trade between India and the Mediterranean flourished along routes that passed through the territories secured by the Mauryan-Seleucid Treaty. The Jain tradition preserves a remarkable account of Chandragupta's final years. According to this tradition, the emperor who had conquered an empire through force of arms and cunning strategy renounced his throne in his later years, embracing the Jain faith and its radical commitment to non-violence. Travelling south with the Jain monk Bhadrabahu, Chandragupta is said to have reached Shravanabelagola in what is now Karnataka, where he ended his life through the Jain practice of Salakana, a ritual fast unto death that was considered the most spiritually meritorious way to depart from worldly existence. Whether this tradition reflects historical reality or represents a later attempt by the Jain community to claim the prestige of association with the great emperor, it captures something profound about the Indian understanding of power and renunciation. The Chakravartin, the universal monarch whose chariot wheel rolls unopposed across the earth, was always understood in Indian thought as a figure who had achieved worldly success, but who might ultimately transcend it. The greatest kings were those who recognized the limitations of earthly power and sought liberation from the cycle of rebirth. If Chandragupta did indeed end his days as a Jain ascetic, he would have been following a path that Indian tradition considered the highest possible culmination of a royal life. The empire that Chandragupta left to his successors would reach its greatest extent under his grandson Ashoka, who would transform not only the political but the moral landscape of the subcontinent. Ashoka's famous edicts, carved on rocks and pillars throughout the empire, proclaimed a new vision of governance based on dharma, not the dharma of Brahmanical ritual, but a universal ethical code emphasizing non-violence, religious tolerance, and concern for the welfare of all beings. Yet Ashoka's achievements were built on the foundation that Chandragupta had laid: the administrative apparatus, the provincial system, the network of roads and officials that allowed the emperor's will to be communicated across vast distances. When we place the Mauryan achievement in global context, its significance becomes even clearer. In the same decades that Chandragupta was building his empire, Alexander's generals were dividing the Macedonian inheritance in a series of brutal wars that would ultimately produce a fragmented Hellenistic world of competing kingdoms. Rome was still a regional Italian power, struggling against the Samnites and decades away from its great Mediterranean conquests. In China, the Warring States period would continue for another century before the Qin unification. The Mauryan Empire was, in its time, one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in the world, comparable in scale and administrative complexity to anything the ancient world had yet produced. The intellectual legacy of the Mauryan period proved equally enduring. The Arthashastra, whatever its precise date of composition, preserved and elaborated a tradition of political thought that had its origins in Chanakya's circle. Its discussions of statecraft, diplomacy, and governance would be studied by Indian rulers for centuries, its principles invoked and adapted to changing circumstances. The concept of the Saptanga, the 7 limbs of the state, comprising the sovereign, ministers, territory, fortifications, treasury, army, and allies, provided a framework for understanding political organization that influenced Indian political theory for millennia. The religious pluralism that characterized the Mauryan period, the coexistence of Brahmanical traditions, Buddhist and Jain communities, and older practices of nature worship, would become a defining feature of Indian civilization. Unlike the religious exclusivism that would come to characterize much of the Mediterranean world, India developed a tradition of multiple religious paths coexisting within a shared cultural framework. This pluralism, already evident in Chandragupta's time, would be explicitly promoted by Ashoka and would remain characteristic of Indian civilization through subsequent centuries. As the warm night air settles over the Gangetic plain, as the wooden walls of Pataliputra fade into the darkness, and the sounds of the imperial capital give way to the quiet of the countryside, we can imagine Chandragupta in his final years, reflecting on all that he had built and all that he was preparing to leave behind. The young man who had learned the arts of war and statecraft at Taxila, who had raised an army from the chaos of Alexander's withdrawal, who had overthrown the mighty Nandas and faced down the Seleucid king, who had constructed an administrative apparatus of unprecedented sophistication. This man had transformed the political landscape of an entire subcontinent. The empire he created would endure for over a century after his death, reaching its greatest extent under Ashoka before beginning a gradual decline. But the patterns he established, the centralized administration, the professional army, the systematic approach to governance, would influence Indian political thought and practice for millennia. The vision of the Chakravartin, the universal monarch who rules through Dharma, would remain a powerful ideal for Indian rulers long after the Mauryan dynasty had passed into history. And so, as the stars wheel overhead and the night deepens, we leave Chandragupta to his legacy, an empire that stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the shores of the Bay of Bengal, an administrative system that rivaled anything in the ancient world, a tradition of political thought that would endure for millennia. The young man of obscure origins, who had seized an empire from the chaos of a collapsing world, had created something that would outlast him, something that would shape the history of a subcontinent and influence the development of civilizations far beyond its borders. The warm night air carries the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of the river, the same river that has flowed past Pataliputra for millennia, witnessing the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of dynasties, the endless cycle of human ambition and achievement. And in that flow of time, the achievement of Chandragupta Maurya stands as one of the great accomplishments of the ancient world. A reminder that in moments of chaos and transformation, a single individual with vision, determination, and the right guidance can reshape the course of history. Let the gentle rhythm of the river carry you now toward rest, as the story of Chandragupta fades into the soft darkness of the Indian night. The empire he built has long since crumbled, its wooden walls rotted away, its palaces reduced to archaeological fragments. But the patterns he established, the traditions he founded, the vision he embodied, these have endured, woven into the fabric of Indian civilization, a legacy that continues to shape the world we inhabit today. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder of ancient empires and the quiet wisdom of those who, having achieved everything the world could offer, found peace in letting it all go. Good night.